Welcome back to O'Connor Tonight, and another very serious topic we need to talk about here is the children and family and marriage. All of these things tie together as much as the left would like to pretend that they don't. These are all very, very important topics that all matter to each other. Here to discuss this with me is Emma Waters. She is a research associate at the DeVos Center for Family Life and Religion at the Heritage Foundation. Emma, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on, Doug.
Of course. So like I mentioned, these are all topics that really kind of click together. You know, the left will try to pretend that marriage can be between two men, or it can be between 50 different people, or it can be between whatever you want. But that's not true, right? And the Respect for Marriage Act is sort of a vindication of this. They're basically trying to push this messaging on the state. So tell us a little bit about that and what it means now that this act has passed.
Yeah, so the Respect for Marriage Act explicitly repealed the Defense of Marriage Act, right? That still said in our public law that marriage is between one man and one woman. So there are two major concerns that we have here. The first is that it doesn't provide any affirmative religious liberty protections for religious institutions, nonprofit organizations, schools, or even private individuals. And not only that, it has a private right of action that actually allows private parties to sue these same groups of people based on their own perception of discrimination. So this is terrible for religious liberty and opens the door effectively for endless lawsuits against religious persons and institutions affecting their tax-exempt status, any of their licenses, federal grants, or their accreditation right for schools, and leaves them with no protection, which is horrific. But the second part is that when you redefined marriage in Obergefell to be between any man, any two men, or any two women, right? We effectively said that for raising children, we don't need a mother and a father. And the Respect for Marriage Act just further affirms this, that children actually don't deserve or need a mother and a father for the sort of love and protection and play that's essential for their well-being.
So it sounds like there's really two points of problems with this act. One, it seems to be very hostile towards religious institutions that hold traditional views of marriage. And secondarily, it actually impacts children from, you know, having a traditional marriage structure, a mom and a dad, that is probably more helpful for them. Let's start with the first one. Is there any chance that we could get religious protections in place into this bill, or is that ship sailed?
So there is still an opportunity. Respect for Marriage Act passed in the House last week. It's going to be signed into law by Biden any day now. But one of the main priorities for the Heritage Foundation for the next Congress is actually having Mike Lee's Respect for Marriage Act amendment added on to the current Respect for Marriage Act. So this could get passed in the next Congress. And while it wouldn't address the concerns regarding children and families in America, it would at least protect religious institutions and schools. And with the majority in the House and a fighting chance in the Senate, there's still room where this could happen.
Are we seeing that the left is possibly primed to take advantage of this, where they say, got this legislation passed, now we're going to go after some of these religious institutions? Obviously, we see right now the 303 creative case, very much based on the idea that the left is going to go after you if they feel like they have an opportunity to do so. Do we see that happening? Like, are they prepping anything?
Oh yeah, absolutely, right. So the fact that we already have a Supreme Court case without the Respect for Marriage Act means that it's just opening the door for endless cases like this. And so I think we can expect to see this on every level of our civil life, right? And in every aspect of the government too. So think about the IRS and its 87,000 new employees, right? What are they going to do except for start looking at religious institutions, schools, and churches and assessing, okay, is that discriminatory action because you're not embracing same-sex marriage based on your sincerely held beliefs? If that's the case, they could start denying or removing tax-exempt status, which once again could risk the very ability of these institutions to even stay in existence.
Now, the second point that you made is that this impacts children. And before we sort of get into the actual impact that children have sort of had as a result of this bill and the left's greater push to sort of redefine marriage, I want to ask a question about how we got to this point where traditional marriage seems to be villainized anyway. So polling data suggests that Americans have completely shifted their views on gay marriage. It seems like what used to be a very controversial issue, now even for Republicans, is relatively popular. How did we get here? How did we get to the point where gay marriage is now accepted by everybody?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is the halfway truth between politics is downstream from culture and culture is downstream from politics, because you're right, before Obergefell passed, there was very little support and even practice of same-sex relationships. But as soon as that was passed in our judicial law, right, like the law is a teacher, it started shaping the values and what was socially acceptable in our nation and in our law almost instantaneously. And then in the last 7 years, you have like what, 25% of Gen Z who's identifying as something other than heterosexual straight. Right. And that's a sort of rapid progression that's unparalleled throughout history that can only point back to the change in law itself, right? Mm-hmm.
Now, Emma, speaking of children, you have made some really interesting points and written some very interesting articles about surrogacy. So, to me, or maybe to the average layperson, surrogacy really doesn't seem like that big a deal. You look at a mom who maybe can't have a child by herself, she has somebody else do it for her, clean it up. Why is that a problem?
Yes, so it's important here to distinguish between altruistic surrogacy, doing it for the kindness of your heart for a woman who's sincerely like infertile, right, and can't have children, versus commercial surrogacy, which is paying another woman to rent her womb to have children. Sure. And so that's what we're focusing on here, right? But the problem with that is that, first of all, the entire process when it comes to the medical ethical concerns is incredibly dangerous for children. Majority of children who were formed via IVF or in vitro fertilization are never actually born into live babies. Either they're destroyed in the lab or they're frozen for an indefinite period of time, or they're not actually viable once you implant them in the pregnancy. So when it comes to the pro-life concerns, there's a ton of issues here that have to be faced. But then when it comes to the industry itself, there are no federal regulations governing this. And so it's managed on a state-by-state level. But because it's a relatively new technology, very few states actually have adequate laws protecting it. So whereas for adoption or foster care, you have background checks, you have screenings, you have references, you have home visits. With commercial surrogacy, none of those things are in place, which means, no guardrails, which means that any man, woman, single or in a relationship can effectively buy the requisite parts, be it sperm, egg, or even a fully formed embryo, rent the womb of a woman and implant it in her, and then produce a child, which when you look at is relatively similar to baby selling.
Yeah, seems a little suspicious, a little shady, maybe not the most above the board. But I guess my question then is, how do you fix that? What are the laws in place that maybe would regulate this, or should it be regulated at all? It should just be banned.
Yeah, well, and that's a great question, because once you say regulation, you've already pushed it into a permissive language. And this is the problem with all of our reproductive technology, is we haven't stopped to ask ourselves, is this actually good for children, for the ethos of a nation? And instead, if we can do it, we should do it, has been the mindset. So I think first things when it comes to policy is, one, we don't have federal regulation, so a lot of this would have to happen on the state level. But first, we need tracking and reporting mechanisms. So for example, in the state of California, surrogacy contracts are only reported to one government agency. And the law explicitly says it cannot be exposed or revealed under any circumstances. And so we have no way of even tracking who these children are or how many of them are being born via surrogacy.
Sorry, so they're just like this database of shadow children that like don't really exist. That is surreal to me.
Yeah, especially when it opens the door to international surrogacy. So you can have, say, Chinese nationals, for example, literally birthing children through American surrogates with no accountability or tracking on our end whatsoever.
So it's a national security issue now as well.
To say the least. A national security issue. It completely perverts and changes our immigration status and even our citizenship, right? Because with our birthright citizenship, if you're born in the United States, you have it, even if you're then being shipped back to another nation where you're geographically and culturally raised according to their values, not American values.
Right. I mean, I hadn't even thought about there were national security, geopolitical concerns to this. And real quick before we wrap here, I want to get your take on what I think is probably a sort of most recent example of a larger trend about sexualizing and exploiting children. I'm sure you've seen this Balenciaga stuff about the weird like BDSM bears and like this weird sexualization of children in the ads. What are your thoughts about that, and how do we fix that?
Yeah, exactly. So this flows all the way back to Roe v. Wade, right? And like the baby taking industry in abortion, the baby making industry in commercial surrogacy are all based on the same premise that children are goods to be fashioned and designed according to adult desire. And so then what comes next? It's what we're seeing in the Balenciaga scandal. It's children who, if they're really there just to fulfill adults' desire, then what if the adult's desire is the sexualization or exploitation of children? What if that's the thing that they really want? Then why not use children in the same way? And that's effectively what this Balenciaga scandal has just proven.
I mean, it's absolutely disgusting. I'm so glad you came on to talk about it. But that was Emma Waters, a research associate at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you so much. More to come on O'Connor Tonight.